And what's supposed to be the insurance capital of the world, some Democratic leaders want to know why more than $100 million in state contracts were awarded to out-of-state businesses, including an actuarial firm in Arizona, and the governor's portrait to boot. At Pine Davidson Printing in Hartford.
It's definitely an art.
An art that for 3 generations the Davidson family has been perfecting, except when it comes to lost business from the state.
It's bad enough not to win contracts in your own state, but when you hear about the business going to Arizona or such states, that really makes it even worse.
The company's owner says during the past few years, he's lost $2 to $3 million in state business that was given to other companies in other states. And apparently, he's not alone.
Connecticut's income tax forms are printed in Massachusetts. And if you get a refund check, it's printed in Lincoln, Rhode Island.
Outraged by the fact that state taxpayers' dollars are being poured into businesses from other states, today Democratic lawmakers proposed a bill which would give Connecticut businesses the state's business, as long as they're within a few percentage points of the lowest bid.
If we have a choice, we're going to choose a Connecticut business.
Citing the governor's portrait as more proof.
There's a contract out there for the governor's portrait. It's $18,000.
Senate President Don Williams says out of 37 bids, 35 from Connecticut. Guess who got the job?
The artist that was chosen was one of the 2 from South Carolina.
Rel says she was only given a few choices, but didn't hire the artists. Legislative management did.
They bring in the work of 6 artists. Choose one of these artists.
So not knowing if they were from Connecticut
exactly.
or not from Connecticut. And you didn't know this person was from South Carolina.
I did after.
But the bottom line, Rel says, is the lowest bidder usually gets the job to curtail corruption and save taxpayers money. And here now to talk more about the money we spend on businesses from other states is Senate President Don Williams, who spearheaded this effort. And after you found out, Mr. President, that does sound a little different there, Mr. President of the Senate, I should say. It makes you sound like the President of the United States. But after you found out the Department of Social Services was outsourcing, what was it, $112 million in state?
$117 million.
$117 million,
yes.
Including to an actuarial firm?
Yes.
That does seem a bit ironic in the insurance capital of the world.
Well, it does. And what we want really is sort of the golden rule for Connecticut companies. We should treat our companies in Connecticut the same way that our companies would be treated in other states when companies from those states come looking for a state contract here. And what we find is that some states have a preference for their own companies if, say, they are within 5% of the low bid.
And Michigan being one of them. So essentially in Michigan, if you're not a local printer, you can't get a printing contract in that state, correct?
That's a great example, because in Michigan, they do all their printing in the state of Michigan. And for example, in the state of Connecticut, we have this Blue Book. It is essentially the Bible for the state of Connecticut. And
as far as government and rules and regulations, printed by the Secretary of the State's office.
Everything is in this that you need to know about Connecticut pretty much. It's been printed for a long time. You might think it's printed in Connecticut. It's printed in Michigan. So they have a tremendous advantage in terms of coming here for Connecticut taxpayer contracts, whereas Connecticut companies could never get a printing contract in Michigan.
So essentially what you're saying is if we can't play ball with you, you're not going to play ball with us. Is that where this takes this step to?
It's the golden rule. We will treat their companies the same way our companies are treated in their state.
Now I did speak to the governor about that, who said, well, as far as she was concerned, she told me that she believes there is a preference for Connecticut companies that already exist. And she was a little confused about your plan. She was curious to know, is there a difference between a preference and equal treatment? Let's go to tape and hear what the governor has to say.
I would have to see how that actually plays out. Does it, in fact, give us an equal playing field, or does it make us charge more for products and we as taxpayers end up paying more for it? Frankly, my concern is still about jobs, and this new proposal, I don't think really changes too much of what we already have on the books.
Response.
It changes it significantly. It's about keeping jobs in Connecticut, keeping taxpayer dollars in Connecticut whenever bids are very close. And actually, if we're within 5% or so, if you keep that in Connecticut, even if you're paying a few percentage points more at the outset of a contract, think of it. The dollars stay in Connecticut, they support Connecticut companies, they pay Connecticut employees, and they all pay their taxes and buy products here in Connecticut. We wind up a big winner when you add all that together.
All right, so we have to talk about the budget as well. So I guess the last question on this is the governor said she was a little baffled why you picked this example of the portrait that was painted, I guess as a lieutenant governor. That's still a work in art. But someone had said that the photographer for this has actually been flown up to Connecticut to take pictures of the governor going back. It seems like quite an expense. However, she says she didn't hire this person. Legislative management hired the portrait.
Well, I don't fault the governor on this score. I mean, although art is very subjective, we know that, but there were 37 folks who applied. 35 of the artists were from Connecticut, 2 were not. One was from South Carolina, and the artist from South Carolina was chosen. That's fine. It's ironic that in South Carolina, they actually have a preference for in-state companies.
Another example that you're talking about.
If a Connecticut artist was applying for that same contract in South Carolina, if the South Carolina artist was within 7%, we would have lost that job.
So that's another case of leveling the playing field. Let's move on to the budget. Democrats came up with their own budget plan that was actually lower than what the governor had requested, I believe, in Republicans. Republicans were very thrilled by that. However, they're a little skeptical. First of all, your reaction to this. It lowers spending overall, but does increase spending for new programs.
Well, it's $110 million below the governor's budget that she submitted in February. I applaud the Appropriations Committee for taking a look at our current economic situation. I mean, it's a reasonable budget for tough times. Families are tightening their belt, and the Appropriations Committee, I think, took a very smart and effective step for the budget in Connecticut.
And again, this is a budget that does call for $154 million in new spending for new programs. And according to Larry Cafaro, the minority leader in the House, he says that it's all hedging on the fact that perhaps the state may have over budgeted for Medicaid. So he said if Democrats are right, they'd vote for it a second. If they're wrong, that's what he's concerned about. Let's go to tape, hear what he has to say.
If they are right, if those numbers are correct, and this budget holds together, I think everyone behind me here would vote for that in a second. But if they are wrong, and those numbers are wrong, the effects are devastating. Not just this year, but next year, 2010, 11, and 12, and beyond.
So he is basically saying, if you're wrong, that Connecticut could end up in the same situation as New York and New Jersey, facing massive deficits where they're also facing cuts or tax increases.
Well, this is not the Democrats saying this. This is our Office of Fiscal Analysis, the same office that Representative Cafaro relied on last year when he said that we were underestimating revenues. And indeed, it turned out that there was an additional $800 million in revenue. So last year, they were saying, rely on the Office of Fiscal Analysis. And this year, they seem to be questioning that very same impartial office. That's what we're relying on. So
if things change in mid-April, when I guess you will know for sure when the final numbers are in, then you can tweak, correct?
Well, that's absolutely right, but that's as it pertains to new revenue. In terms of our budget numbers, they add up, and OFA, or Office of Fiscal Analysis, stands behind the budget as presented by the Appropriations Committee.
We're really out of time, but I have to ask you quickly. The governor has mentioned that she has asked department heads to trim back their budgets by 5% and has also asked for a hiring freeze. You surprised to hear that?
No, I'm not surprised, but I think the approach of the Appropriations Committee, which is not to just simply say across the board, let's cut, but to look at different areas and say, you know, we might need a little bit more in this area and we can cut a little bit more in that area. That's a more thoughtful approach.
Prudent thing to do?
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shelley.
We appreciate it.